And good evening. It's April 16th, 2024. We're in our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. It's another series from Tim Mackie. It's called Eat This Book. On TheDustyFeet.com, the Outside the Class section, we have the Eat This Book source video section set up for your review. The intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. That would be in the source video playlist, right? We try to keep these to about 15 to 20 minutes or so because we make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we continue our Eat This Book series with Israel's Exile, hitting bottom, outside the class on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. Eat This Book, Israel's Exile, Hitting Bottom, Part 2. Okay, so as we left off last week, it seems, not only from the stories in Scripture, but from our own lives, more often than not, the walk away from God tends to be more of a drift away. It happens slowly. We drift. We have an expectation, say at church. So we just decide to become disconnected. We drift away from friends. We then build up expectations when they're not met. That gives us just cause to move along, to move on, to shun those very relationships. And we see that very evidence in the tie to Israel's exile, that it was the broken and shunned relationships, then the drift over literally hundreds of years, with God watching and God pleading through his prophets. So then we get to the other side of the expectation coin from God's promises, right? Because they will impact the story, along with our lives, because God promised both blessing and curse. You know, there's a point where we tend to make or we hear spoken when we talk about Torah. Again, it's just because we always need to bring this back into context to what we're talking about. Because there's a good chance that you've heard, terms like legalistic, weighty, cumbersome. But you've also heard here in the Dusty Feet, I don't agree. But we don't agree with that. But in that thought process, because somebody told you, because they described for you an expectation of Torah. Yet the scripture tells us something anything but. We tend to do one of two things when we deal with it. We either don't read them, by far the largest percentage, or we ignore them, mostly because they're tied to the other side of the coin. And when we don't read them, here's the tie-in, we drift away from the direction of God, or we even end up setting up our own church entity cultural expectations. You know these. You need to go to church every Sunday, dress in your Sunday best, maybe a Wednesday meeting or some men's group or women's group or small group. Maybe a committee. Be an elder, a deacon, an usher, parking lot attendant. You get the picture. Okay, now here's where will tend to divide the room, but bear with me to the end so I can give my context thoughts. Because I'm not saying that any of these are bad. Okay, well, you know my thoughts on Sabbath being on Saturday. Again, a scriptural thing. But let's not get hung up there. The rest of them, I can see all of them being probably very good, very helpful anyways, very engaging. Yet again, when I read Torah, it seems that most of it, and I mean the greater bulk of it, is based on just everyday life, all day long, 24/7. So they're not necessarily in competition, as much as they need to be intertwined. So here's my connection point. We drift from God for many reasons. A few of the reasons that jump to the top are either unrealized expectations and/or broken relationships. Because what expectations did we have of God or others in this context, right? Most appropriately, we're talking about church. Someone in church, someone you know, even are close to, now has broken fellowship with you. The reasons could be justified. That opens up a whole can of worms that we'll maybe get to down the road. And they could be unjustified. But how that is experienced in church, will church be any different from the rest of the world? Will there be a divide amongst those people? Divide amongst the churchgoers? Some on one side and some on the other. A couple separating is the boldest and brightest example of that. And in this context, that bright light is not a good one to be in. But divorce, it's real. It's messy. It's brokenness on a public scale. Because divorce happens for all kinds of reasons. And yet I'd contend that many start just from a slow drift. Expectations not met, or the commitment to the covenant deciding it's not going to be kept. Over time, the relationship fractures, gets broken, and we justify our actions to handle the pain. Slow or quick, I'd still contend even with the quick, it's really been a slow building waiting to happen. But the fracture's there, and then it gets dealt with. So now we're going to add sides taken to the mix in a place meant as a haven for restoration and healing. Doesn't happen. Okay, I've personally experienced this, so this is not a purely hypothetical question. The slow drift, covenant broken, sides taken. Okay, I'm not here to figure out ways to make the divorce thing work. This is not the focus of this, so don't get stuck here. What I'm talking about is our actions, all of our actions, everyone. But does that drift away from the covenant? Because there are expectations, whether in a marriage or with God. It's God who uses the marriage covenant as a physical picture, right? As that same relationship with Him. Hey, okay, I just thought about this. I wonder if marriage covenants had more text to them, right? Not just the for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, for sickness and health, but more definitive text. Because those words, they're rather general, almost nebulous as it were, but what if the marriage covenant had more definition? Would we then just dismiss them and we might call them onerous, legalistic, cumbersome, just can't do it? Food for thought. But it should help us gain a better understanding of the covenant between God and His people. Because either way, in marriage or with God, we all still tend to do the same. Drift, wander, and eventually it becomes straight turning away. We might even have people in our lives, friends, those that care about us. They might even know and try to warn us, right? Maybe subtly in the beginning, more directed later. But with the children of Israel, they had the prophets. These folks, that they were their own. They're in the same need for a relationship with God, but they are the ones chosen to speak up. Because this is God's way of letting them, right, the children of Israel know, hey, I know you need to stop, turn around, return, or the other side of the coin can happen. They had drifted away from Torah, The marriage is in shambles. This is not the path to take. This is the language of God, the language of every prophet, including John the Immerser and Jesus. Before the exile, God uses words for the reasons that the other side of the promise coin is happening. He lets them know, you're following other gods. That's unfaithfulness. You know, that language even gets as strong as whore. Because she, again, that would be us, had gone to another, right? We had given them God's sacred space. But that might start it as a drift. I'll even go with 99% of the time, that's how it starts. The slow drift. Then wandering. Then turn away. Let's get back to Mike for a bit. And although Tim has no idea how or exactly when it happened, but the drift started. Tim saw some of it eventually down the road, but by then it was full bore turning his back on. He's walking away from both God and his family. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe it's just a long-term drift away, but I think we have a problem with doing long-term commitment. You know, we either try to worm our way out of it, look for that clause out, or we just quit. But you know, Jesus had a little bit to say on the matter. So I want to stretch us a bit. I want you to think about this as I wrap this up. Remember when I say quite often that Jesus uses words when he's talking to his audience, these same chosen people of God who are living out this dilemma that they're in, because living out the consequences of their ancestors, but they're also living out their own consequences. But the words that Jesus used are meant to remind, right? Don't forget. Don't forget, Jesus is a prophet to his people. Hence, the focus on being called to the lost sheep of Israel. So his words, as a prophet talks, are reminders. And the words are, and Tim uses the phrase that I like very much, glowing hyperlinks. They hearken us to another place, another time. So Matthew 5, why is the marriage divorce statement so short? If we read it out of context, then it really seems short. I mean, there's still other things that might be worthy of some discussion. And yes, the practice of divorce had gotten way out of hand, and that was partly due to the loss of the original covenant. But it's also a glowing hyperlink, a reminder to the children that God had done this very thing he's talking about, the same thing to Israel, for the very reason that Jesus uses in Matthew 5:31. Because when he gets it and he starts it, it says, it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her certificate of divorce. It's a direct hyperlink to Jeremiah chapter 3. They would have heard that. Ouch. Jeremiah 3:8. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, that I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce. And yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, for she went and was a harlot also. I encourage you to read the whole story in Jeremiah. It's rather eye-opening, and it does make it clear how we got to where we are. Because this is more than just a legalistic position. This is the very core of the covenant. The drift, the wander, the walking away. It happened in Mike's life. We only got a glimpse of the path that he seems to have chosen, and we see, with the results of the path of the ancestors of the children of Israel that had taken, because both involved God not being there to protect and defend. You turned away from God. You know, that's the very terror of King David, exile. Okay, so we're going to continue this next week with their exile, hitting rock bottom, but more of a look as to why we are where we are. And because it's not a surprise, it's not unexpected, it's not even unwarranted. Because this is the promise. God keeping his word. We always expect him to do this, right? We want him to do this. It's just at times we just don't like it. But it is God at his best. Really. Because he, in all of the pain of the exile, he stays the course. And you know, we see the exact same thing from his son in the end. So thanks for being with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class, Israel's Exile, hitting bottom on the Dusty Feet.